So, with the help of White Dwarf number 211 and White Dwarf number 173, I set about painting up a skeleton drummer to go with my regiment of skeleton warriors for my classic fantasy undead army. A quick look in the later White Dwarf actually had a recipe for painting some skeletons, and these were actually a lot more darker and a lot more gothic looking as opposed to the earlier undead paint schemes, which was a lot more vibrant. And I'm just going to be using that later White Dwarf as a bit of a guide for some of the shading, and I'm mostly going to be sticking for that earlier classic, more vibrant look as seen here. And this is what I managed to come up with. After a quick scrub, it was time to give it that classic white undercoat, and it didn't rain, it didn't storm, and there was no wind, so I felt like I was already off to a pretty good start. Once I had a fresh wet palette, I went ahead and just used a base coat of Nostalgia 94's bleached bone, and I did thin this down a little bit, and as usual just did a few coats to get a really nice base coat. And I find this is where the recipe is already a little bit different, as I'm doing a base coat of bleached bone before doing the shading, whereas when I done the horses earlier in the previous video, I just went straight in with the shading over a white undercoat. So to paint the fabric around the drum and the fabric that's over his head or on his skull, I just used a 50-50 mix of Vallejo Game Colors, Scarlet Blood and Hot Orange. And I find this was really good as it wasn't too red, wasn't too orange. It was almost like a really saturated, kind of like a red orange, as I didn't want to go too red or too orange. And I thinned this down a little bit and just did this in a couple of coats as it covers quite well. And as usual, the main body of the drum was painted with Troll Trader's counterfeit gold and a spot of chestnut ink mixed in there just to help enrich it a little bit. While the drum was drying and while the red was drying, I started to make my way around the skeleton and began shading this. And to do this, I just followed a little bit of the recipe from the later White Dwarf, which was flesh wash and a little bit of black wash in there just to darken it down. And before I started going through doing that deeper recess shading, I just went through with some very thin flesh wash. And the idea with this was that I would thin it down with water. It's very thin, and just begin to sort of make my way around the model and just sort of glazing it into the recesses just to slowly build up that kind of undertone of shadows before going in with that deeper recess shading. And you can see here, just doing those layers of really thin flesh wash just helps kind of build up that undertone of shading before going in with that darker recess shading. And it's just going to help tie it in and maybe just soften out the transition a little bit more. Then I just went through with the darker shade that I'd made earlier and just started putting this into the deepest recesses of the skeleton. I kept going and just kept referring back to that White Dwarf magazine just to make sure I was trying to copy as best as what I could as to what I was seeing in the pictures. And here it is with a darker shading, and it definitely brings out a lot of the bone and all the other little details in the skeleton itself. And once I was happy with this, and while it was drying, I started to make my way around the rim of the drum, which looked like it was a blue color or a deeper blue, which would then get highlighted with a lighter blue later. But just for the base coat, I just used some Vallejo's Game Color Heavy Blue. Once the rim of the drum had its base coat of heavy blue, I then just went in with TT Combat's Crypt Bone and then just put a couple of coats in for the base coat of the skin of the drum. And I would also use this to start highlighting up the bone, just thinning it right down and kind of glazing up those highlights again, and just sort of concentrating it on more of the raised areas, and then just slowly adding more white as I began to highlight the bone further. Oh, and just quickly, you can see at the back of the drum the dome shape. I just went over this with about 4 very thin glazes of chestnut ink and just making sure I pushed most of that pigment and make sure my brush stroke would finish in those deeper recesses where his arm reaches up and over the drum, just making sure that it builds up in there as a bit more of a gradual shadow. And you can see I'm just going back over, highlighting up that bone towards the edges, just using very, very thin down crypt bone. And this also just helps, I think it just kind of helps transition those kind of chunkier looking shadows into a bit more of a smoother highlight. And again, just trying to reference off of those images in the White Dwarf magazine. And then I just start making my way around, adding some more white into that bone color and just picking out more of the sharper details. I then used magic blue and just went around the rim of the drum, avoiding the deeper recesses. Onto the reds, and I just used Crimson Gore from Nostalgia 94, and I thinned this right down and just gently brushed it into the deeper recesses of the red areas. And this was also done on the skull covering on top there as well, and I found this worked really well. It did take a few layers because it was quite thin, but I just wanted to be a bit more of a softer sort of transition before adding in those final highlights. To paint the strap that holds the drum across his shoulder, I just used a 50-50 mix of Scorpion Green and Sick Green. And I figured I'd do this because then I could just use pure Sick Green to begin that soft shading around the little skulls on the strap there. Once I was happy with the initial shading, I just then grabbed some mutation green, thinned it with a little bit of water, and then just began to place this even tighter where those skulls meet the strap. And here I'm just going over the skulls with some of that bone color, just being sure to avoid those deeper recesses that I'd shaded earlier. So one thing I find is that some of these older metal models especially, some of the details can be a little bit difficult to distinguish, such as these little skulls here, but I decided to just give them the same recipe as the main skeleton character, and once I'd applied a thinned down flesh wash, it then became pretty apparent where some of the eye sockets and things like that were, which did make this next part a lot easier, and I just went in with that darker wash and then just picked out the deeper recesses. So I began to highlight the strap for the drum, and I just used some thinned down scorpion green for this and just painted it on the edges as well as the flat surface in between the skulls, just to gently build up that highlight. I then made my way around that strap and then just used some scorpion green again, this time less thinned, and began to paint it on the very edges of that strap, just getting it ready for that final highlighting. Then a final edge highlight of scorpion green and sunburst yellow was mixed together and then just placed on the very edges. I decided to paint the snake that was wrapped around his right arm, and I did this the same color as the strap that holds the drum, just to kind of bounce off and sort of even it out a little bit. And before I did this, I just went through and just shaded those deeper recesses in and around the snake, just using that darker bone shading of flesh wash and black that I'd used earlier. And then before I base coated the snake, I just recoated it white just to tidy things up a little bit before getting it ready to paint. Once it was given a base coat, it was then highlighted with scorpion green. Some of the details were a little bit difficult to pick out, but I just did the best I could. Then some Blood Sharub's Red by Nostalgia 94 was used to pick out the highlights, and I just thinned this to about the same consistency as the shading that I did for the red earlier, and I just applied this over several coats just to gradually build up the softer highlights and just making sure I had enough room to fit the next stage of highlights within the previous highlights. Then it was time for one last layer before moving on to the final stage of highlights. I then used Fiery Orange from Nostalgia 94, only thinned very slightly, and just placed this on the very edges. Once I was happy with all the red parts now highlighted, I just decided to go over it with some very thinned down yellow glaze. And I did this over a number of layers, just making sure it was dry before I went and put more on, and I find it just brought everything together. And you can see here it's very thin, but I just find it helps just bring it all together, and again, just following those reference images from the White Dwarf, it just makes the red look like a lot more of a saturated orange, and this could be probably due to the film stock they used to photograph, or maybe even the color grading, but I just used it as a reference anyway. The buckles for the drum were first given a coat of Chaos Black, then a coat of Bolt Gun Metal, and then some highlighting with some Mithril Silver. I went through and just added some Skull White to the Magic Blue, and then just highlighted the rim of the drum as best as I could. Some of the detail was maybe obscured or a little bit hit and miss, but I just went around and followed it as best as I could. Again, just trying to match what I was seeing in the White Dwarf. So it wouldn't be a proper send-off without a layer of PVA glue, some sand, and some watered down Goblin Green from Nostalgia 94, just to match the models that I already have. And here we have him, Skeleton Drummer. Here he was spotted with a white, leading some rambling skeletons into battle. And spotted again with some archers. Well, he gets around a bit. He's definitely a busy musician. But thank you so much for watching, again, if you've managed to stay awake, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.